All right, so get this. We're diving into this story today, and it's a bank robbery. But it goes so sideways that, like, this regular LA street turns into, like, a scene, straight out of an action movie. We're talking shootouts, homemade body armor, and just ammo. Like, just mountains of ammo. Enough to make you think, like, were they planning a war?
This is the North Hollywood shootout. And it's not just about the crazy events themselves. You know, it really exposed this, like, vulnerability in police tactics and equipment. And it changed the face of law enforcement forever.
Yeah. And, you know, the sources you sent over, this YouTube documentary, with witness accounts, actual footage from the scene, it's wild. We're going to unpack not just what happened, but, like, what it reveals about how criminals think, how quickly these situations can escalate, and the challenges that cops face when things go completely off script.
Exactly. This case is like a window into a world that most people only see in movies. And it forces us to ask some tough questions about crime and preparedness in a world that's constantly changing, right?
Totally. Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Mătăsăreanu, two guys who went from fitness buffs to full-blown criminals. But what's interesting to me is how their crimes, like, escalated over time. They weren't always about these huge, violent acts.
Right. They kind of started small. Scams, weapons possession. But there's this pattern there. Each crime got more daring, more violent, like they were testing boundaries and seeing how far they could push things. This is a classic example of what criminologists call escalation of criminal behavior.
Yeah.
And it often culminates into something major like, well, this shootout and the planning involved here is insane. They weren't just, like, winging it. These guys were making their own body armor. They were stockpiling weapons. It was like they wanted to be walking arsenals. This level of preparation goes beyond just wanting to be successful criminals. It speaks to a mindset obsessed with control, with power. They even modeled their approach after the movie Heat, specifically this thing called the 8-minute rule, which emphasized getting in and out of a robbery before police can respond. They weren't just criminals. They were aspiring criminal masterminds.
It's almost like they were living out a fantasy, but with real-life consequences.
Exactly, and those consequences became very real. On February 28, 1997, picture this, a Bank of America branch in North Hollywood, right on a busy street, not some secluded back alley, but a place surrounded by businesses and homes. If things go wrong, a lot of people are at risk.
And they did go wrong right from the start. These guys are popping phenobarbital. Muscle relaxant. Now, was this to keep their cool during the robbery?
That's what's debated to this day. Some experts say it was to stay calm, under pressure. But think about it. Phenobarbital can also cause drowsiness, confusion. What if they weren't just trying to stay calm? What if they were prepared to die rather than be captured? That detail adds a whole other layer to this story.
It does. And then things get even more messed up. They get into the vault. And it's mostly small bills. ATMs are offline. Their big score is turning into a bust. That must have ramped up the tension like crazy.
Absolutely. Their plan is falling apart. They're likely feeling trapped and desperate. This is where that escalation, and we talked about earlier, kicks into overdrive. It's no longer just about the money. It's about survival, about lashing out against a situation that's spiraling out of control.
So the LAPD arrives, sets up roadblocks, starts evacuating civilians. Pretty standard response, right?
At first, yeah. It seems like a textbook robbery response. But then the first shots are fired. And everything changes. These guys weren't armed with just handguns. They had fully automatic weapons. And armor-piercing rounds. Now, for those who don't know, armor-piercing rounds are designed to penetrate body armor. The LAPD was completely outgunned.
And we see this play out with one officer in particular, James Abareva. He's fresh out of the academy, only 2 months on the job, taking cover with detectives behind a flimsy newspaper kiosk.
And they felt relatively secure, thinking they were dealing with handguns. But imagine the shock, the terror. When those bullets start ripping through everything, suddenly those textbook tactics are useless. It's a terrifying realization for those officers. They are in a real-life war zone with no way to fight back effectively. And this is where the North Hollywood shootout becomes like this turning point, you know? It exposed this critical gap in how prepared police were for this kind of heavily armed criminal. They just weren't equipped or trained for that level of firepower.
Yeah, it's like that church just showing up to a knife fight with a spoon. The playing field was totally uneven.
Exactly. And this incident forced departments across the country to, like, reevaluate their tactics and equipment. We see this rise in patrol rifles, better body armor, and changes in SWAT protocols, all stemming from this event.
Okay, so let's talk about those protocols for a sec, because it took a while for SWAT to get there, right? Why was that?
Well, at the time, SWAT teams were typically only deployed for hostage situations, barricaded suspects,
Yeah.
very specific scenarios, a bank robbery. Even one as chaotic as this
Right.
wasn't usually considered a SWAT call. But the North Hollywood shootout, that kind of changed that thinking. It became clear that SWAT teams needed to be able to respond more quickly to situations involving heavily armed suspects, regardless of what the initial crime was.
So you've got this initial response happening, and these officers are essentially pinned down, outgunned, facing these two guys who seem almost invincible in their homemade body armor.
And, it's important to understand that this body armor wasn't just some slapdash DIY project. They used layers of Kevlar, steel plates, strategically placed to cover vital areas. They even had modified helmets with bulletproof visors. This wasn't about protection from a few stray bullets. It was about creating a near impenetrable shield against the police's standard weaponry.
That's chilling. It's like they were prepping for war, not a bank robbery.
And that level of preparedness says a lot about their mindset. They were obsessed with control, with power, with creating this image of themselves as like unstoppable forces. They wanted to dictate the terms of the engagement. And for a while they did.
But amidst all this chaos, we see these incredible acts of bravery from officers like Martin Whitfield. He was shot multiple times, femur, arm, chest. But he still manages to drag himself to safety.
The subject is free while bleeding profusely. Whitfield's survival is a testament to human resilience, to that primal instinct to fight for your life, even when the odds are stacked against you.
Totally. And then you have officers Todd Schmitz and Anthony Kobunik, who literally drove their patrol car into the line of fire to rescue their wounded colleagues.
Think about that for a second. They didn't have armored vehicles. They were in a standard patrol car.
Yeah.
And yet, they repeatedly drove into that active shooting zone, knowing they were basically sitting ducks. That takes an incredible amount of courage.
It does, and it's not just those officers. Detective John Krulak, even with an ankle injury, was focused on getting other officers to safety, especially those without body armor.
It speaks to the sense of camaraderie within the LAPD, the willingness to look out for each other. Even in the most extreme circumstances, they were facing a threat unlike anything they'd ever encountered, and yet their instinct was to protect their fellow officers, even at their own peril.
And it wasn't just the police who showed incredible courage that day. There's a scene from the documentary that really stuck with me. It takes place inside a dentist's office, across the street from the bank.
Yeah, Dr. Jorge Montez's office basically became this impromptu triage center. He treated Officer Ebreva's wounds while bullets were flying outside. Imagine being a dentist, suddenly thrust into a war zone, trying to save a life, with limited supplies and the constant fear that a stray bullet could come through the window.
I mean, that's one of those details that really brings home the reality of this whole situation, how it impacted not just the police, but everyday people just going about their lives.
The entire city was affected, businesses shut down, people were trapped in their homes, and the sound of gunfire was just constant in the air. It wasn't just a localized incident. It was a city under siege.
Yeah, and there's this chilling moment captured in the documentary where Tonya Bellard, one of the dispatchers handling the calls that day, she realized the severity of the situation.
Oh yeah, Bellard's line, they're just dead everywhere. It sends shivers down your spine. You can hear the chaos in the background or the frantic calls coming in. And it's clear that this is no ordinary bank robbery. It's a massacre unfolding in real time. And she's the one trying to coordinate a response in the midst of it all.
It really highlights the pressure and responsibility those dispatchers face in situations like this. They are the lifeline between those on the front lines and the resources they need. And their role is often overlooked.
Absolutely. They're the unsung heroes, the voices of calm in a storm, and they play a crucial role in coordinating the response and ensuring the safety of everyone involved.
Totally. But even with the LAPD doing everything they could, it was clear they needed more firepower to level the playing field. That's when they get creative.
Remember that armored truck they commandeered? It wasn't some tactical decision. It was pure desperation. They saw a civilian driving an armored truck nearby and basically said, we need that. It speaks to the urgency of the situation, the willingness to improvise and think outside the box when the stakes are so high.
And it worked right. That armored truck allowed officers to get closer to the bank and extract some of their wounded colleagues.
It was a turning point, but a risky one. They essentially put a civilian driver in harm's way. But at that moment, they had limited options. It highlights the difficult choices law enforcement faces in these kinds of situations, where the line between acceptable risk and potential disaster can be incredibly thin.
So you have this like makeshift armored truck rolling in, and officers are finally starting to push back. The tide is turning against Phillips and Mătăsăreanu, but it's far from over, right?
Right, and this is where we see the differences in their personalities, maybe their mental states, really come into play. Phillips is pinned down, his AK-47 jams, he switches to a handgun, and then in this like chaotic flurry of gunfire, he's down.
Was it suicide? Did he get shot by the police? It's still debated, right?
The exact circumstances of Phillips's death are unclear. Some believe he deliberately took his own life rather than be captured, while others argue he was killed in the crossfire. The autopsy report was inconclusive, adding to the mystery surrounding his final moments.
And while all this is happening, Mătăsăreanu is making a desperate attempt to escape. He tries to drive off in their getaway car, even tries to carjack another vehicle. When his tires are shot out, what was he thinking?
It's hard to know for sure. Maybe panic set in. Maybe he was hoping for some miracle backup. Or maybe he just refused to accept defeat. Whatever his motivation, his actions show how unpredictable these situations can be. Even when a plan falls apart, people can react in unexpected ways.
Yeah, and in the end, Mătăsăreanu is surrounded, wounded, and engages in this final shootout with SWAT. It's just a brutal end to a chaotic day.
Over 2 hours of intense gunfire, over 1,000 rounds fired in total. The street looked like a war zone, and the psychological toll on everyone, the officers, the civilians, even the first responders who arrive later, it's impossible to fully comprehend.
You mentioned PTSD earlier. Can you talk about that a bit more? Like, how did this event impact the officers involved? Not just physically, but mentally.
So post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a very real consequence of being exposed to traumatic events.
Yeah.
Like this shootout. Many of the officers involved struggled with flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, even survivor's guilt. Imagine having to process the fact that you were in a gun battle on the streets of your own city, outgunned, fighting for your life. That experience leaves a mark, and for some, it takes years to heal.
And the impact goes beyond those directly involved, right? The entire city, the country, watch this unfold on live television.
It became a defining moment, a stark reminder that the kind of violence we see in movies can and does happen in real life. It sparked a national conversation about gun control, about the accessibility of high-powered weaponry, and about the need for law enforcement to be better prepared for these kinds of situations.
Just like a line was crossed that day, and there was no going back.
Exactly. The North Hollywood shootout forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our society, raise questions about the militarization of police, about individual rights versus public safety, and about the responsibility we all have to address the root causes of violence.
So after this deep dive into this crazy story, what stands out to you the most? Is it the criminal minds behind it all, the incredible acts of bravery, or the lasting impact on law enforcement? This case really makes you think.
For me, it's the intersection of individual choices and systemic failures. You have Phillips and Mătăsăreanu, driven by their own ambitions and delusions, making terrible choices that led to this tragedy. But you also have a system that was ill-equipped to deal with such a threat, a system that had to learn and adapt in the aftermath.
It's a reminder that we can't always predict or prevent these events, but we can learn from them, and we can work to create a safer world. And sometimes it takes a tragedy like the North Hollywood shootout to spark those conversations and drive that change.
Absolutely. This is a story that continues to resonate, to challenge us, and to remind us that vigilance, preparedness, and a commitment to understanding both the criminal mind and the systems we rely on for safety are essential in navigating an increasingly complex world.
Really is. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.